You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Heard this one before? The state's general fund budget is in trouble, as is the transportation budget. Inflation, higher than expected costs, lower than anticipated revenues, state services scheduled to expand. If you listen to KUOW, you are probably aware of why the state is facing budget shortfalls. This next segment, though, is about a fiscal bright spot for Washington's budget: the money generated from the cap and invest system. That's part of the Climate Commitment Act, which voters upheld in 2024. So here's how that works. The state sets a limited amount of emissions allowed each year by major companies. That is the cap part. Companies that emit more than they're supposed to have to buy an allowance in a state-run auction. The latest auction generated $394 million. The money is supposed to go towards climate investments, like air quality monitors, electric vehicle chargers, and public transportation projects. But Governor Ferguson is eyeballing that account and wondering what other possibilities are out there for that money. He recently proposed using more than $500 million of that money to fund the Working Families Tax Credit. That's a refund that gives money back to low and medium income state residents. Meanwhile, Republicans, perhaps seeing an opening with the governor's proposal, well, they say they want to use the money to offset utility costs for schools. Environmental groups are already pushing back against the governor's proposal. The budget fight, it's come for this big pot of money, and we are going to hear a couple of perspectives on this issue today. And we start with Todd Myers, the Vice President of Research at the Washington Policy Center. Hey, Todd, thanks for being back on the show.
Thanks for having me on. Always nice to chat with you.
So we're going to get into some of your findings in a moment when it comes to the CCA and the money that it is generating. But first, I want to just bring up the fact that we've talked before about this. You were trying to encourage voters to do away with the Climate Commitment Act in 2024 when I-2117 was on the ballot. Voters ended up preserving that program. They voted to keep the state's carbon auction. So now we have the question of what to do with all this money. What do you think that the cash from these polluters, these polluting companies, should go towards? What's your opinion about this?
Well, I think the first thing is that the costs of that system are much higher than was anticipated. In fact, there is a sort of a circuit breaker about if the cost gets too high, and we have tripped that circuit breaker multiple times. California, who has basically the same system, has never tripped that circuit breaker, and we've done it, I think, 4 times now. The other thing is that at the beginning of the year, the Department of Ecology put an estimate on what they thought the cost would be per metric ton of the permits, which then gets translated into energy costs and gasoline and things like that. The last auction we had in 2025 was higher than the highest estimate for 2028. So we are well ahead in terms of costs and what it is costing people, and therefore also revenue. So what you've got is a big pile of money that exceeds what we expected. And so it doesn't surprise me that people are trying to be creative about how to use it. The other challenge that we have is that about 70% of the money that has been spent so far has no CO2 reduction benefit. So when people say, oh, we shouldn't take it, we shouldn't use it for things that weren't intended, the vast majority of what we're spending the CCA money on already doesn't have a CO2 reduction function, and much of the money is really more for things that are for special interests and political, rather than for things you would say, yes, that clearly either is reducing CO2 or avoiding impacts from climate change. So I think that there's a lot of games that get played with, well, you can't, use it for unintended purposes. We're already using it for a lot of, marginal unintended purposes, and we've got a lot of money, more money than we anticipated in the first place.
What are some examples of those programs that you say do not help reduce emissions and, in fact, are kind of going already towards unintended purposes? What's one or two examples of that?
Well, one of my favorites is that, and people may disagree with me, but there's $25 million in this budget to go to local communities for climate planning as part of the Growth Management Act. nobody thinks the Growth Management Act has achieved its goals, and adding one more goal for climate planning, $25 million, is not going to have much more benefit. We pointed out that also in the first 2 years out of the 1.5 billion, there was $15 million paid for bicycle education for elementary and junior high school students. Now, if you can tell me how bicycle education is supposed to, help the environment, there's this very sort of theoretical tie, I suppose, but it's nobody's idea of an important expenditure. So there's a number of things in there that we are spending money on now that are very tenuously related to environmental protection or climate change.
You're known as a watchdog of this stuff, this climate policy in our state. And I want to highlight something that you dug up recently. You're the person who pointed this out in the first place. And it was a claim about the impact of the Climate Commitment Act money. Washington's Commerce Department, which oversees how the money is spent, it claimed late last year that 3,600 CCA projects had cut almost 9 million tons of carbon emissions. Well, you looked at that number and you said, no way. What did you find, Todd?
Yeah, so one of the things that I have been frustrated with is like, look, you can agree or disagree with the CCA and the CO2 tax, but if we're going to get the money, spend it wisely. And the metric I always use is how much CO2 reduction you get for how many dollars. Washington, the projects that we do are very expensive, thousands of dollars per metric ton, when on the market you can get $10. So what I saw is that they claimed that we had reduced the equivalent of taking 40% of the cars and trucks off the road for a year at $40 a metric ton. And I knew both of those things were wrong. And so I started just scrolling through the projects, and I found several that were $1 a metric ton. Now, that would be fantastic if it were true, but I don't think there's a project in the world that is $1 a metric ton, unfortunately. And I knew that was skewing the numbers. And so what I said is that, about 86% of the claimed reductions simply are false. They don't exist. It's just wrong. And it didn't take me long to catch this. Literally the day they put it out, 3 hours later, I was on Twitter saying, this is wrong. And that's, I think, the most frustrating thing is that if I could recognize it immediately within hours, why can't the Department of Ecology, why can't the Department of Commerce, who are supposed to be the experts in this, catch such a major error?
Yeah, the actual savings, the carbon emissions saved were just under 4% of the original estimates. Joe Wynn, who is the outgoing head of commerce, said it was a fat-fingered situation, that there was, just some small errors made. But it turns out once Commerce released its correction, there were several, 8 projects, something like that had to actually be corrected down. So it wasn't just one error. It was a pretty significant overshoot. So back to this issue of what to do with this Climate Commitment Act dollars, Todd. What I'm hearing you say is there's already a lot of spending coming out of this account that is not necessarily tied one-to-one with climate reduction. So the governor is saying we've got this fiscal shortfall, we've got the budget issues. He wants to use it for working families' tax credit. It's codified in the law. It was added actually also by the Commerce Director, Joe Wynn. What do you think about that plan by the governor?
Well, the reason it was put in there is because energy taxes are regressive, and so they were trying to find a way to offset that regressivity. Working Families Tax Credit does that. It's a little bit of a distortion of the Working Families Tax Credit. The Working Families Tax Credit is designed to encourage people to get entry-level jobs. It's supposed to be an alternative to the minimum wage because the minimum wage makes it harder for people who don't have experience to get jobs. Working Families Tax Credit is supposed to help them. We do both of them at the same time, which is sort of silly, but nonetheless, that's why it's in there. I think, given the fact that the prices are much higher than were anticipated, that we have much more money, that we ought to do more of this sort of rebates. We ought to do a general tax cut. We ought to do a general rebate. In 2016, I supported a revenue neutral carbon tax, which cut taxes and then put a tax on CO2. That's the kind of thing. So if, we have a lot of money, we're not starving for money, as you said, from the CO2 tax. And given the fact that there's such a big bucket, I think that we ought to do more tax relief for everyday families. Everybody's prices are going up. Affordability is a problem for everybody, not just for the people who qualify for the working families tax credit.
Before we go, you've been on the state's case about being too slow about posting emissions reporting. That's something that you filed a lawsuit about. It was eventually dismissed. We know that greenhouse gas emissions went down slightly in 2020, but then went up again in 2021. Both of those years were below pre-pandemic emission levels. We don't have data from 2022 onward. What do you think going forward the state could do better here? Obviously you want them to post the data. Is there anything that, that they could shift here that would get Todd Myers on board with the way they're approaching their climate commitment promises?
Yeah. Well, when we filed, our case was thrown out because we didn't have standing. But in the course of that, the Department of Ecology admitted two key things. One, they admitted that they were in violation of the law. They're supposed to have data past 2021. It is now 2026, and the most recent data we have about how Washington is doing is in 2021. That's ridiculous. That's useless. The second thing that they admitted is that they could do it. They just haven't allocated the resources. The 2022 data from the federal government, but they use partly federal data, that data has been available for more than a year. 2023 data is available. So they could do it. It's just not a priority. And I think that's the frustration. So if we actually care about how we're doing and using that data to see, okay, what's working and what's not, then having 5-year lag times makes absolutely no sense. So that, I think, is my frustration. I think what's happening, and in the case of the errors that I found in the failure of the CO2 emissions, reporting, I think that there is just a sense that they know what they want to do, and the data are not necessary for them to know what they want to do. They're not using the data, either the accuracy, of the data in terms of how we're spending it or how we're doing. They just say, here's what we want to do, and data can only get in their way. And that, I think, is the totally backwards, unscientific, ineffective way. And that's why I think you're going to see, when we finally get the data for 2022 and 2023, I think you're going to see emissions go up for both of those years, which puts us in a really bad position. My calculations, using sort of the estimates, show that to meet our 2030 targets, we will have to reduce emissions by more than the equivalent of 2 COVID reductions in the next 5 years. That's crazy. That's a very high cost for failure. We're simply not going to meet it unless we figure out, unless we find a way to spend our money and be effective.
Todd Myers is the Vice President for Research at the Washington Policy Center. Thank you, as always, Todd, for being here.
Nice to chat with you.
You're listening to Soundside. We're going to continue this conversation about what to do with the CCA dollars when we come back with the architect of the Climate Commitment Act, who would much rather this money not be diverted to help balance the budget. He wants to see it stay with climate projects. And he'll respond to some of what you heard from Todd in just a moment here on KUOW. Back with more Soundside, I'm Libby Denkman. We're talking about the state's carbon allowances auctions, part of the Climate Commitment Act, where companies pay when they generate too much climate warming pollution. And specifically, we're talking about where the revenue from those auctions should be going. In the original bill, the proceeds from CCA auctions are generally supposed to go to environmental programs like clean transit that help mitigate climate change. But in his latest budget proposal, Governor Ferguson said he wants more than $500 million of that CCA money to fund an existing tax refund for low-income income families, as the state is facing a big budget deficit. Environmental groups have pushed back, but this use of the money is allowed under the language of the law. For more, I'm going to turn now to former State Senator Reuven Carlyle. He is the founder of Earth Finance, and when he was in the legislature, he was the architect of the bill that created the Climate Commitment Act. Reuven, thank you very much for coming in and being here.
Thank you so much.
So I want to get your first reaction. You know, we're coming out of a conversation with Todd Myers there. Todd talked about some of the data transparency issues that the state has had, according to him. You know, before we get into how the CCA money is being used, your reflection on why don't we have any data after 2022?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, let's just step back a little bit and recognize that 62% of the people of Washington rejected an effort to repeal the Climate Commitment Act last year. And we won in Yakima and in all kinds of Republican counties. And so it's just a real endorsement of the importance of investing in climate and sustainability in a responsible way. And I really appreciate, Todd and the Washington Policy Center's ferocious opposition to climate action that they've had from the very beginning, and their belief that a cap and invest program doesn't make any sense. But, as you know so well, this is an evidence-based global best practice. This is the most widely used climate policy in the world. And the data is very compelling that it reduces emissions overall between 5 and 21% in the most economically efficient way. California, for example, reduced their emissions by 21% while their GDP grew 80%. So it's a very evidence-based global best practice. There's all kinds of legitimate issues about how we operationalize it, how we get the data out the door, how we track the data. So it's super important to have that full transparency. There was a delay in part because of the state and in part because of the federal government and the change underway with the data there. So huge operational challenges and issues, but it's been overall on target relative to the policy itself. And I think that's what the people of Washington have stood for.
Not great to have the state overestimate the carbon reductions by such a degree, though. 9 million tons versus 300,000. I mean, your reflections on that. Obviously, you weren't involved in that release, and they have corrected it since. But what did you think about that?
Absolutely. It's, look, we have to have improved data quality systems. At the same time, candidly, it was one data set, and they captured these heat pumps and assigned a very low value to them. But you take that one piece out, and the data was accurate. So, but ultimately, the policy itself of the cap on pollution, the cap on emissions, is what drives the emission reductions. The investment of the dollars that comes from the program is really about not only reducing pollution, but it's also about adaptation. It's about resiliency. It's about wildfire prevention and flood mitigation. It's about all of these high-value investments like free transit for young people. Every young person in this state, 18 and younger, can hop on any bus, any ferry, and any train free of charge. That's paid for by Climate Commitment Act dollars. So the cap on emissions is the central driver of the reduction of emissions, and the investment dollars are really about building that quality of life for the public.
Why did the Working Families Tax Credit end up in the CCA as one of the acceptable ways that the money from the cap and invest system, the money from the allowances would be used? It seems out of left field to me as somebody coming to this issue for the first time, saying, okay, everything else is like, hey, electric buses, things like that. But, Working Families Tax Credit doesn't seem to have a carbon reducing element. So how did that end up in the bill? Absolutely.
It was absolutely one issue and one issue only, and that was a political deal. We had, a tight vote situation. The bill passed the state Senate 25-24. And there were some progressive members of the caucus who really wanted to just have that additional potential funding source to increase the working families tax credit for the potential to offset costs. I, at the time, preferred a utility tax refund, the way Governor Inslee moved forward on, but it was a political compromise. My good friend, former Senator Joe Wynn, was the author of that, and we worked really hard to sort of come up with a negotiated settlement. I would say that under no circumstances the spirit of that political compromise did it anticipate supplanting general fund operating dollars with climate dollars. It was only thought of as the potential to add or supplement and buy additional tax relief for low-income folks. So I'm pretty disappointed in that development, but that's politics.
So what do you think about the governor looking at the short-term shortfall and then kind of the larger structural issues with the budget and saying, well, at least for now, in order to keep the working families tax credit going and to kind of keep the budget, balance it in the first place, we're going to need to dip into the CCA account. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I readily acknowledge that technically they have the legal right to sweep these dollars. I would plead with the legislature with just a profound sense of humility on behalf of the 62% of the people who voted to protect the program, to maintain the highest level of integrity in the nexus of value between the dollars that are paid into the Climate Commitment Act and the investment in mitigation, in climate resiliency, in climate adaptation, in new ferries, in multifamily housing charging, in free transit, in public health, in clean air and clean water, and salmon restoration, things that are really directly tied to the nexus of climate and sustainability. I acknowledge that people move on from the legislature and they have that legal right. But ultimately, they really are saying that other non-climate related categories are a higher priority by sweeping those dollars. And the truth is that once you get used to the addiction of having a new revenue source, it's very hard to ever go back. So, I would just note that the entire state budget, operating budget, transportation budget of the state, and capital budget totals about $100 billion a biennium. So that's $50 billion a year. The Climate Commitment Act raises about $2.7 billion in that time period. So basically, less than 3%. So it's the dedicated fund for climate and for sustainability and resiliency. And I just would hope that we keep that nexus of value and that we invest in people's quality of life directly in a way that adds meaningful value to people's quality of life.
I heard from Todd Myers, basically his argument was that the CCA accounts are already being used for things he feels are not directly reducing emissions. I mean, he brought up bike education and all kinds of, money to help cities with the Growth Management Act, things like that. And he's saying if you're already opening up the CCA accounts to that, then sure, why not use it for something like this, for balancing the budget, the working families tax credit? What's your reaction to that?
Look, we live in a representative democracy, in a constitutional republic. We elect people to govern. We elect people to write budgets. And that democracy is messy and clunky and infuriating and joyous. And the truth is that people are going to write this budget and write these budgets. The dollars that are invested under the Climate Commitment Act have a direct nexus of value. Not every penny is inherently meant to mitigate emissions. Let's talk about who we're talking about, who pays this cost, okay? In Seattle, the largest emitter is Ash Grove Cement, I think. So, people drive on 99, you see that large cement factory. They emit about 75,000 metric tons. So they have to buy allowances to deal with the negative externality of that air pollution, of that pollution. And that affects the Duwamish River. It affects everything. Ultimately, public health, clean air, clean water, investing those dollars from Ash Grove Cement and Nucor Steel and the refineries of our state, 120 large entities emit over 25,000 metric tons. We're asking them to pay for the negative effects of their own product. That is the most conservative idea that there is. It's fiduciary. It's responsible. We're investing those dollars. So it's easy for folks to say bike paths don't matter. It's easy to say any one program isn't right. But most of the money goes to public health. It goes to clean air. It goes to clean water. It goes to public transportation and salmon restoration and wildfire mitigation and multifamily housing charging. Let's really think deeply about climate and sustainability and the value of those investments. And it's not just one little program here and there. It's a systems approach to dealing with the impact of climate change.
I think that this conversation reminds me a little, and stop me if you think I'm going too far, of the conversation that we have about the Jumpstart tax in Seattle, which is that, this was a tax that was passed on big businesses, and these are large employers that, have to pay the tax if they have employees that hit a certain level on the payroll, basically higher paid employees. And in Seattle, initially, it was supposed to be invested in housing and also actually climate resilience. But the city ended up relying on it time and time again, and still does, to balance the budget. And even the architect of getting Jumpstart passed, Katie Wilson, who's now mayor, she said to me last week, that it's going to be really hard basically to shift off of that anytime soon. Is this just kind of what happens when there is a big revenue, bump from whatever the tax is, whatever the purpose was, that budget writers start to say, we're in a tight spot, and there it is. There's that pile of money. So it looks attractive, right? And again, this is in the law. It is allowed to use it for working families tax credit. But I see the pain in your eyes when you talk about please think about, not doing this, or at least mitigating it as much as possible. But do you think this is just inevitable?
Ezra Klein's book, Abundance, is really a deep source of conversation among a lot of officials. And one of the central ideas of it is that blue states and blue cities have to prove that they can govern. And I think we're living in a time where there's such a sense of profound disappointment in the institution of government and the institutional integrity of government. I think that there's a cost to sweeping accounts, to creating funds like that. And I think the core hypothesis that you're putting out there is fair, which is, in effect, folks pass a tax or a fee under one premise, and then as soon as the dust settles, they use it for something else. I think it does deep institutional damage to the moral authority of the institution of government. I think it's a mistake. I think we have to recognize that the public deserves the highest level of integrity of the use of their precious tax dollars. People are really hurting. Affordability issue is real, and we all understand that. I think it's incredibly unfair to supplant sources of funding that may be healthier for the general operating budget, because they are choices. They are making choices. And I don't think any of us should hide from the incredibly honest assessment that the city and the state, for example, have spent a lot of money. The increase in the budget on both has been exponential and substantial. Those are choices. But to then, for example, sweep the Climate Commitment Act dollars, which are, again, just a fraction of the overall public investments and are so necessary, wildfire, salmon, everything we talked about, I think is a disservice to the moral integrity and the moral authority of government, especially when you have a source that has been validated by the public. And I think we lose something of credibility as public officials, as an institution. And I think we show that blue cities and blue states struggle to govern when we do that.
Reuven Carlisle is a former state senator. He is the architect of the bill that created the Climate Commitment Act, and he's the founder of Earth Finance. Thank you so much. Reuven, good to see you.
Thank you so much.
You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman, and we did reach back out to Todd Myers at the Washington Policy Center about Reuven's claims about the Climate Commitment Act, specifically that the investments part of Cap and Invest, the programs funded by those auction revenues, that they're not really designed to be the key drivers for reducing emissions. The cap part is. Well, Todd told us this.
The cap certainly plays a strong role in reducing emissions. But that wasn't how the CCA was sold. The CCA was sold that we must keep the revenue. We can't do a rebate, a tax rebate or a tax cut, because that money is necessary to reduce CO2 emissions. The law that he wrote actually requires projects to be judged based on effectiveness, but that has been ignored. So I think that there is a bit of a bait and switch here, where initially they said, oh, we need to keep the money in order to reduce CO2 emissions. And now that they're spending the money on things that don't reduce CO2 emissions, they say, well, that's not really the key. I think that's a big problem.
Todd Myers added that the state is still far from meeting its emissions goals, and spending money wisely is imperative to reaching those benchmarks and eventually hitting net zero by 2050, if we can get there. Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.